Okay, we're on the home stretch now. This is the final week of transport planning in regional planning. So this week we're going to follow on from last week in terms of what you need to know to put in place a good strategic transport plan. That includes what kinds of information and data are needed for transport planning, who the main actors and stakeholders are in transport planning, who should be involved but maybe not involved, and included in that, how can the public and non-experts be involved in what is still a very technical area that's dominated by engineers. And we need planners in transport planning. We need people who've got the kind of skills that planners have. Engineers are not planners, and some of them adapt really well. But in general, Australia doesn't do a good job of teaching engineers how to be good planners. So you're needed. Let's start with what information we need. Obviously, there's some basics around understanding the transport features and the land use patterns in your area. So typically a GIS department would be helpful here, and not all councils have that capacity, but let's presume that they do, where they can use, for example, Australian Bureau of Statistics data to model the density of where people live in their local government area, so they know where the so-called bedroom suburbs of where people sleep, and then they also know what the attractors are and where people are going and what typical kind of high demand routes are. So this might mean a whole lot of spatial work to create maps to get a sense of demand, but it might also mean actual measurement, manual counting. City of Hobart still does quite a lot of manual counting in terms of looking at traffic. Obviously there's traffic counters that you can put on the road, but sometimes they need the sort of information that can't be easily measured, in which case that they'll get people out on the street collecting data. Information is needed around, what the daily life requirements are. So is there a very concentrated peak of movement? How distributed is a transport movement? So some of this information will come from automated data collection from, say, vehicle counters. But again, some of it might need to be collected manually. In terms of checking back with your strategic plan, is there information available that clearly states what the priorities are? This might not be public information, so it might not be obvious from the documents that you're able to access on web pages. But council, in terms of its internal working, should have a very clear sense of what the priorities for investment are. That they often don't becomes very evident when there is some sort of a congestion crisis, for example, like the City of Hobart has been experiencing on and off. And then all of a sudden there's this scramble, and it's apparent that the planning isn't really up to the task, and then all of these ideas come up, and it's really the kind of situation that you want to avoid in terms of good longer term planning. Council should have a good sense of what their infrastructure priorities are and what they're trying to achieve, so that when there is some questions around that, they're able to go back to first principles and able to go back to evidence and data and say, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. That's particularly demanding on the smaller councils, but even then, they should have a very clear sense of where they're going and what their priorities are. And then there's also all sorts of data that you can collect that would fall under the category of market tools. So congestion charging, how the market might work in terms of car parking costs, what happens if you increase, decrease costs, change costs, what costs are involved around land use development. Might incentives need to be withdrawn rather than provided to be more consistent with a sustainable transport plan? Might alternatives need to be subsidised, at least in the short term when ideas are being tested? Should people be encouraged through some sort of financial incentive or parking availability to try something else to ride to work? And there are all sorts of examples of this kind of incentivization. You only need to look to a city like Portland in the US to see all of the amazing things that they've done to shift their mode share. And some of it has cost money, some of it has cost a lot of money. But they've decided that that's what they're doing, and they've made great progress. Of course, spatial analysis is incredibly important in terms of understanding transport demand, where people are coming from, where people are going to. This is an interesting paper about the City of London and transport disadvantage, published in 2000. And so what they did was use variables like the proportion of households within 400 metres of bus stop, proportion of households within 800 metres of a rail station, proportion of rail stations that are fully accessible to wheelchair, a range of variables, and then combined this information with the City of London's geographic information systems and came up with a map to figure out which areas were problematic in terms of travel time. So you can see here one of the images from the paper that shows travel times in grey here, where obviously the further you go out, the more disadvantaged you are, that it might be taking you more than an hour to get where you need to go. So UTAS has some particular expertise around GIS and transport. Some of you might already know Jagannath Ariel, who did his PhD looking at GIS and transport in France and continues that theme. So if you do have an interest in GIS or expertise in GIS and looking to do some research, then I would definitely go and talk to Jagannath. The type of data collection that I've had most experience with is, of course, bikes and active transport. So that does include pedestrians as well as people on bikes. Part of the reason for this is that unlike cars and bus transport, where basically Metro can provide really good statistics of patronage, it's much harder to know accurately and in a kind of detailed way across your city how people are moving about through walking and cycling. So Bicycle Network run every March an initiative called Super Tuesday, where people sit by the side of the road and count bikes for 2 hours. Many local councils, many is an exaggeration, some local councils do this more thoroughly than once a year, but for some councils this is their annual snapshot of whether things are changing. It's a bit flawed in that if the weather's bad, the number of bikes are down, but over time a picture is being built up. So I think we have 8 years of data now for Central Hobart that give a sense of which areas have an increasing number of people on bikes and which are staying more or less static, which does apply to a lot of them actually. So the smaller image on the left here shows some data from central Melbourne. Wow, some of those intersections in central Melbourne have a huge number of people cycling through because riding to work is a much more viable option than what it used to be. The City of Melbourne has made some hard decisions around closing, for example, Swanston Street to cars and making it a tram walking and biking area. And this photo here shows Swanston Street, and it shows how one of the intersections on Swanston Street has changed. I know these pie graphs are very small, but they're easy to understand once you know what's going on. So the pink is the proportion of female riders and the blue is male riders. Typically, in an area where there isn't good cycling infrastructure, it's mostly blokes riding, mostly sort of younger to middle-aged men who don't mind riding in traffic, who are not as risk averse as quite a lot of the rest of the population. When you do provide facilities and you make it a safer, less stressful option, then you see that mode share of the number of women riding jump right up. And in some intersections in central Melbourne, it's now up to half-half, basically. There are, of all of the people coming through, say 100 in an hour, 50 of them will be women. So we're a long way off that in Tasmania, but in places that have decided that they're going to invest in options other than private car transport, things are turning around. So this does require data. If you've got goals around increasing mode share and walking and cycling, you need some sort of way of checking on that. The vehicle counters can be calibrated to count bikes, but they don't count heavy motor vehicles and light bikes very well at the same time. So you can't just put a rubber strip across the road and have it count all sorts of different transport. Basically, bikes need their own little calibrated counter, or you need people next to the road doing the counting manually, which is very expensive unless you're managing volunteers, which is what Bicycle Network manages to do. So see what you can find out for your region, which might be Hobart, about how many people are choosing to walk and to ride. Some of the stats that you'll be able to find out by Googling will come from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So during the census, people are asked questions about how they got to work. So that also is a snapshot into what's happening. But it's very general. If you're wanting to plan across a local government area and you want the resolution of knowing which routes are important, or indeed which routes are being avoided, because even though it's nice and direct, it's just too scary and there's no room for people other than drivers, then that sort of information needs to be collected somehow. And often isn't, or is only collected in a small way. Motor vehicle data is a lot easier to come by. So this table here shows the different types of recorders, and it says what is needed for different numbers of locations. So manual surveys is the top one. So while it's easy enough to do this for a couple of locations, if you're monitoring lots of different places at once, that's going to be really expensive. Paying somebody to sit out on the road and actually count traffic. Councils will do them when they're desperate, when the situation requires that kind of expenditure. So for example, in Hobart, when the traffic was changed on Sandy Bay Road, because council knew that it was going to be reasonably controversial, they got in before any changes were done, collected a whole week's worth of manual data, that's very expensive, put in the changes, and then were able 6 months, a year later to go back and evaluate whether things had changed using good quality data. Pneumatic tubes is what you see on the right here in the image and is the third row of this table. So it counts vehicles, or actually axles, as it crosses, and it's able to figure out whether the quick double axle is a car or whether it's a car with a trailer in case of 3 axles, whether it's a heavier truck. So depending on the pattern of which the motor vehicle crosses, it's able to roughly classify what type of vehicle it is: motorbike, car with trailer, heavier truck, light utility vehicle, and provide really good quality data. What it can't do, what it's not calibrated to do, is record pedestrians and bikes. I mean, usually, hopefully, pedestrians are not walking on the road anyway, and bikes are too light. It just misrecords the data, and so it's really only good for motor vehicles. You can get this type of technology for bikes, but it has to be calibrated for bikes, and you can't have cars, heavier vehicles running over it. There's all sorts of other technology, such as having a beam across whatever your counting point is, whether it's a mountain bike track or whether it's a road, and when the beam is broken, then that counts as a data point. So the other somewhat labour-intensive way of doing things is video. So sometimes you'll have video at, for example, intersections recording vehicles, but then somebody has to sit there and go back through and actually annotate the video to get the data. So whatever way you're actually recording the data, it needs to be sensibly done in terms of what you're wanting to get out of the data, because especially when you start getting people involved in either the manually sitting on the road counting or going back through video, you're talking expensive. So you need to be sure about why you want it. In talking about data, the other thing to mention here is a different approach that councils are increasingly using to get a feel for what might work and to get away from the whole comprehensive technocratic approach to planning. And it's essentially a concept that's also called living laboratories. Universities use this quite a bit. UTAS certainly does. And it's basically doing small scale, low cost, low risk trials. Some of them are pop-ups, like this example of Parking Day, where local people, local business take over a car park somewhere in town. It's an international day. People participate in Tasmania, and it's just trying something and creating a different space somewhere and changing the use. This has been done formally by the City of Hobart pretty recently. So if you Google local retail precinct plans Hobart, there were 5 sort of inner but not CBD shopping precincts within Hobart that got money to do a pop-up trial. It was pretty amazing actually, and council got quite a lot of confidence about this after, councils are inherently risk averse, and so this was quite a big step forward. So in the conversation about data, don't forget about how effective these small scale trials can be to give people confidence and to try something without having to go to data modelling and saying, okay, if we take out this traffic lane and remove these parks, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is much more complicated than just traffic flow, which is complicated enough. It's also about all these other factors that are quite difficult to measure. So on that, it's also can be quite difficult to evaluate what is successful about a pop-up, and that was the case in the Hobart trial, where of the 5 local precincts that participated, the consultant had to pick a winner, and that was difficult. How do you weigh up all these quite different interventions in different areas? Nevertheless, Newtown's being funded to go ahead, not Newtown, Lena Valley's first, is going ahead and being funded to make those changes that they did temporarily just on one day. So something optimistic to look out for, not just in the academic literature, but also in the much more pragmatic practice of change in local government. The actors in transport planning kind of general level are the same as any other transport or any other kind of planning. There's the 3 level of government, from local council up to state government and the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth needing to step in, of course, when you're talking about big transport infrastructure projects like major roads, rail, port, are all very big budget items, even at the national level. In terms of people getting around daily, local councils are really the key. In most jurisdictions, and this certainly applies in Tasmania, the local roads that you use most often are all council roads. So state government roads in Tasmania are the arterial roads that connect different settlements, that connect Hobart and Launceston and Perth and Devonport. But once you get into an urban built-up area, they're generally council roads. The arterials are still state government roads all the way into town, but anything that connects off those arterial roads will be a council road. So this is where communication between those 2 levels of governments is really important. Public is always important. Good planning always has a connection to public consultation. As I said before, transport planning can be a very technical field, still quite dominated by engineers in terms of decision making. This does make it difficult for individuals to have a say, which is where community groups can be more powerful, because you can get a group of people together whose knowledge and skills together can kind of fill in all the gaps to make up quite a complete, well-informed, quite powerful whole. Not-for-profits like the organisation that until recently I worked for, Bicycle Network, it also includes players like the Heart Foundation, who've been important not just in Tasmania but nationally in terms of raising the bar as to what's required of good land use planning and good transport planning. And of course industry, and that covers just such a vast range of players, from motoring groups like RACT, NRMA, RACV, who more and more are coming around to ideas around sustainable transport. Sometimes it's difficult for them to reconcile some of their different conflicting objectives around kind of batting for motorists and also batting for sustainable transport. But increasingly, organisations like RACT have policies that are consistent with sustainable transport planning. Industry also includes groups like the Property Council of Australia and its local chat to the Property Council of Tasmania, who are very involved privately and publicly in the discussion around land use and planning more generally, particularly statutory planning, what legally a developer needs to provide when land is either being infilled or open up in terms of green areas being built on. So there's a whole range of actors who engage in the transport space. It is very difficult to shift from the status quo if you don't have somebody pushing leaders to be bold. You don't have the public encouraging leaders to make sustainable changes in the transport system, because we're talking about a network where decisions have 50-year consequences. In the case of building major new infrastructure, it costs a lot and it's around for a long time. So those critiquing voices are really important in the transport space. The third online exercise might be that you actually pull together a submission to the Hobart City Council about their private transport consultation, so that's going on at the moment. And if you are going to do that, post your response to the Milo discussion board. So it can be including, the formal salutations to council. You don't need to adapt it, just post to Milo what you're going to send Hobart City Council. If you're not making a submission or you're doing a region other than Hobart, then use these prompts for your third online exercise. So make some comment about how land use planning controls like zoning affect your region's ability to develop sustainable and people-centred transport systems. What can you find in terms of land use planning controls that says something about this? This might not be easy to find, but do have a look in the academic literature to see whether there's already been comment that does that hard work for you in terms of going back to the legislation and what it says. What do you think the prospects are for your region in terms of integrated transport? So what is either already there in planning but not there yet, or just not spoken about yet? So what might be actually missing from plans? And thinking about the advice that you might give your local council, whether it's Hobart or a different council, what do you think are the most important actions over the short, medium and long term that would make the transport system more efficient and more sustainable? So this all needs to be posted by that third deadline.